Can you hear us? I feel like I need to
I hear you fine.
All right. And we have made you presenter so you can share your screen.
I appreciate that.
So I'll do a quick introduction,
I just wanted everybody to know. Before I begin the presentation, I want to let everybody know I was totally prepared to be in Deadwood this time. But since you're not there, I went to Montana and turned left instead of going to Montana and turning right. So I'm phoning in from Lolo Hot Springs and here on a motorcycle, and very grateful to be able to present in spite of the fact that the pandemic keeps us apart this time.
Well, when you have hobbies like motorcycling across the United States, it makes the pandemic a little bit easier to take.
I think that is so. So let's see what I can do to change what application I'm sharing, since seeing that my map is undoubtedly not why you're here.
So a little bit of background. There's a handful of people, and I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, that whenever I see them, I get like butterflies in my stomach. And Paul Vixie is absolutely one of those people. If you were doing computer security, I hate to say it, Paul, but decades ago, he was one of the early titans in this industry. And one of the questions that we asked him in our last webcast are, what are the things that we should be focusing on that people probably aren't focusing on as much as they should? So talking about DNS encryption and what that means, as it says, a war for control, I think fit in perfectly with what we want to cover here at Wild West Hackin Fest. So without further ado, Paul, please take it away.
Well, that's a lot of ado, and I appreciate your kind words. But you have no idea what impact you guys have also had on me. So again, the honor is mine. Thank you for inviting me, not just now, but more than once. And when you do this in person, I'll be back. So last year I talked about DOH, DNS over HTTPS. And this year I thought I should give an update, because not everything good or bad that I promised has come to pass. Some has changed, some has been overtaken by events. I'm going to reuse a tiny bit of material for those of you who were not here last year. But pretty much what I want to let everybody know is how this is rolling out and what are the actual details. Google, Mozilla, Microsoft, and Apple are, of course, the big dogs in this fight. And whatever they do is probably what we all have to live with or work around. And, you know, by and large, it's going okay. There are some super problems and there are some things lurking. But there are also some implications for pretty much anyone who operates a managed private network. For example, me at home or me at work. Or, in a way, I suppose, Russia or China or any authoritarian country. We are all seeing some problems from this. I don't necessarily like having Russia and China as authoritarian countries as my fellow travelers, but in this particular case, our interests are similar. So I'll explain why. So before a lot of the people watching this came of age and started using computers, we had not a lot of standardization. And we didn't have Unix or Linux everywhere. We didn't have TCP/IP everywhere. We had pretty much every vendor doing whatever they thought they could do to serve their customers. And, there was some lock-in. If you were using DECnet, chances were not good that you were going to be able to buy your equipment from somebody other than DEC. Same for Apple Talk and the rest. And, this was good when computers were super expensive, but it was clearly not the way we were going to roll it out when it became a global economy. And, eventually we got Unix on the mini computers of various vendors, but they were pretty well fragmented because everybody added sort of proprietary extensions. You should use, our version of Unix instead of the other guys because it has features X and Y. And Linux came along and sort of swept all of that into the wayside. I know that there are different versions of Linux today, but they're broadly similar across their kernels. If you're using one, you could probably switch to another without having to throw much away. It would be expensive, but more in terms of training your staff than in terms of making a completely different set of investments. And I want to make sure everybody knows this is all about the money. Share price is a present value function. And in that function, openness and cooperation are not valued. Your ability to be disintermediated by a competitor goes up once you're using technology very similar to theirs, such as Unix, Linux, TCP/IP, and so on. You will not be rewarded in the stock market for that. That's just the way it is. We can't change human nature, although I've tried. TCP/IP and the web have been universal for longer than any technology that I've seen in my lifetime. And they are starting now to get collateralized, where you increase the present value by making your stuff work differently. And so what you'll see there is cloud computing, where, yeah, there are multi-cloud providers, but in general, if you aren't careful, you're going to decide you don't want to own a data center anymore, and you're going to put all your stuff into Cloud X, and then you'll discover later that Cloud Y would like your business and is willing to reward you handsomely in terms of discounts, multi-year discounts for it. And you can't move because you've made a commitment you didn't even know you were making. And the same is true of email. You know, we've got IMAP, but every IMAP server and IMAP client has a different naming scheme for its sent items folder, or its trash, or whatever. So if you actually want to use multiple email clients across multiple email servers, and that's my life, you're going to discover that it's chaos. And that, yes, they're all speaking IMAP, but they have all differentiated to the maximum extent allowed by their own customers, because they want you locked in. And again, that's human nature and the present value function. Storage, plugins for your browsers, plugins for anything pretty much. And services are now, they tend to be bespoke. And, you know, yes, in my day job, we offer services over RESTful JSON APIs, but we're already running into people who don't know what new line delimited JSON is. So that there are small bubbles and islands forming as they do for the reasons that they always do. So how does this look for DNS? Let's get to that. So the model of successful, I guess, inventions, successful innovations, is very much the model of giving away the razor and charging for the blades. All of us have encountered printers that were really cheap. What, I can get all those features for $170? Hey, that's great. But wait, it looks like you have got some kind of proprietary vendor lock-in on the toner cartridges. I can only buy them from you or your licensees, and those also cost $170. And I got to pay that, whatever, 4 times a year. But this is not just printers, and it's not just razors. If you think about Windows or Android or the Xbox or the Wii or the PlayStation, making the device, making the platform is not going to be nearly profitable enough to justify the investment. It's only because you get to control the resulting ecosystem and be able to decide, in the case of, let's say, the Xbox, who is going to be allowed to publish games for that platform. Or Apple with their App Store, taking 30% of all the in-game revenue of the games that they sell, that they make available over the Apple Store. And that's, wow, that's a license to print money. And that's what platforms are designed to do. They're designed to be platforms to print money. And, in the case of Windows, they don't have a store that locks you into only apps that Microsoft approves, and Android is the same. But all of the adjacencies, like the hardware, the apps, licensing of things, services around it, like training, all of those flow most directly to the creator and the owner of the platform. And so even if it isn't obviously lock-in, there is an obvious benefit to creating a platform, and it's not charging money for the people to access the platform. It is for charging money for people to get other things like games or apps or services. So, of all the different adjacencies that we have explored in human history, information is the most powerful. And I'm going to rank those for you in a moment. I just want you to know that if you can predict and change human behavior, that would be what von Mises called human action, then you're going to be able to sort of be right where the sweet spot appears. You may even be able to control where the sweet spot occurs. And that also is human action. And so it's all about economics. And war itself, by the way, is all about economics. The war continues until one side cannot afford to continue. And most actions in a war, most battles, are designed to run the other guy's costs up and your costs down. So human action, as understood through economics, is worthy of your study. And if you don't know who von Mises is, just Google for human action, or I guess look on Amazon, since they seem to have monopolized that market. There's some huge stuff that was done back in the 40s that really predicts everything we're seeing. And this is what we're seeing today. This is a modification. I apologize for the poor quality of the graphics. It's a modification of the old OODA loop, which is still used, in my opinion, unfortunately, to control a lot of investments that are made in so-called cybersecurity. I think OODA, it makes sense if you're a jet fighter trying to shoot down another jet fighter, but it doesn't really go toward long-term strategic things like the Cold War. There's nothing applicable from the OODA loop to the Cold War, because strategic things that don't end and they're just lasting, they're just a permanent state of affairs, and you're just trying to have a game with unlimited turns where you win more often than you lose. You need something a little bit more tuned for that environment, and this is mine. So what you're doing here is surveillance, which updates a model and is informed by a model. And that leads to prediction of sort of what your adversary is going to do. And that also updates a model and is informed by a model. That prediction indicates that various actions could be taken advantageously, and that's control. That's where you're trying to move the sweet spot or put yourself in the sweet spot. That, of course, updates a model and is informed by a model, which goes back towards surveillance. What should I look for next in order to be best positioned for the next turn of this unending game? Now, I want you to have one big takeaway from this, and that is that I'm talking about surveil, not observe. The difference is that in surveillance, your adversary does not know what you're seeing. They can't predict what of their actions have been observed and have informed your model. Surveillance is, in other words, somewhat secret, and that is necessary. I'll get to what I mean by adversary in a moment. So historically, we have these domains of force projection. These were all codified for war purposes, for the idea that nations were going to express their will through force. And every time a new one develops, it kind of becomes more powerful than the ones before that. So if all you have is control of land, but somebody else is able to control the seas surrounding that land, you're probably not going to do well in that turn of that game. And so once a new domain of operations has been opened, there is a feeding frenzy of everybody who wants to do force projection to gain superiority in that new domain. And, there was a long time when land and sea is all we had, and we ended up with not just a lot of treaties, but the very definition of nation itself defined in terms of borders that you could draw on a map. And all of that went by the wayside the first time somebody got a biplane with a machine gun and crossed those borders without encountering any of the historic defense and resistance that they would have encountered. And so there was a race to control the air. And some of us here are old enough to remember the beginning of the space age, when all of a sudden everybody had to learn how to get certain satellites for surveillance or whatever military purposes, in addition to the scientific purposes. Where we are now is information, and that is the new domain of operations. This is the information age, and having superiority in the information domain gives you the ability to kind of write your own ticket, whether that's a license to print money or just the ability to unilaterally decide what other people will do. Information is where it's at. And this is the first time that corporations have outstripped nations. Most corporations have information superiority over most nations. That should concern us, not just because of the obvious ways we can think that might be abused or will be abused, since some abuses are inevitable. It should concern us because, as with all the other domains of operations, we didn't have time to think about it before we got here. And so there's pretty much a new invention coming every day that causes information superiority to move around or to be shared by new parties. And we don't know what they want. We don't know what they'll do next. We will know. We will live through this period, and then we will know. And we may wish we had done some things early that we then can't do late. because that turn is over. Now, what's coming next, by the way, is quantum, which is a form of information, I suppose. If you don't know what's going to happen to crypto from quantum, you should look up quantum crypto or post-quantum crypto and see if everything that you're doing or plan to do will have algorithm agility when the best crypto we have is suddenly outmoded because we have a new domain of operations that allows us to guess the prime numbers even if they have 4,000 bits in them. I told you I'd come back to adversary. In warfare, the adversary is, the person you're fighting, the nation you're fighting, whoever is attacking you, that's the adversary. In commerce, that is not so. In commerce, your adversary is your customer. You don't want them to have the free choice of dealing with someone other than you or paying less for a product. So you will tend to make yourself as competitive as possible in order to influence your potential customers' actions. You might also take the actions which remove their other possibilities. We've all heard about buying out a company just to get just to remove the alternatives that various customers would have. You might buy a company just to kill it so that your products can do better in that market. That is sometimes the rational self-interest, best interest of a corporation. In crime, however, we have both of those. In crime, your adversary is both people defending and people attacking, or people that, nations, police forces, that kind of thing. But you also have consumers or competitors who would be the traditional adversaries in a commercial sense. And so when we look at these domains of operations, we have to understand there are a lot of different axes being expressed here. So the platform that we've had before the internet, before TCP/IP, before Linux, before Xbox and all the rest is kind of going away. You're not going to make a CPU as DEC did with the VAX or the Alpha, or as Intel was doing with the Itanium for a while, and say, if you want to be in that market, you have to buy some part of your supply chain from us. You can't dominate that way. There are too many different places that you can get basically Intel 386 compatible hardware. Software, same thing, right? What operating system do you want? And there's also ARM, and I don't mean to sort of ignore other big presences here. I'm just trying to give some examples here, which is that the only thing that really matters today is the platform where the information goes. And that means it tends to be the web. So information is our new platform. Whoever can control that, whoever can come up with dominant platforms in the information domain of operations is going to be the winner of many turns of this game. And that's why we see so many free browsers. Most of you don't know that the first browser that came out really commercially was Netscape, and they charged $49 for it until Microsoft said, hey, we should just make ours free. Now they're all free. But are they? Let me talk about that in a moment. You can have a service like Search or YouTube or anything like that that is free in dollars, right? The people who are using it are not paying you money. But you know who they are. You're not allowing that to be used by somebody whose name you don't know, whose email address you don't know. And by looking at what they do, you can guess where they're going to go next. And to the extent that they are probably representative, you can input that into a model that will then inform where a vast subset of the economy is going to go next. This is why I was particularly unamused by Starbucks recently. I have an app on my phone that let me pre-order a drink and pay for it, and then I could just show up and pick it up and walk out. It was like a breeze. I was fine doing all that, but they recently said, I'm sorry, you can't do that anymore. You must have an account with us. We must know who you are. And of course, they know my credit card number, and for that, they have to know my name. But there are laws against using my credit card information to model my behavior. And that's why they are now moving to a model where, in addition to my credit card number, they've got my personal information. Actually, they don't. It just means I always will from now on pay cash and wait in line. You should make your own determination. If you're watching a YouTube video, you may not see product placement, you may not see an ad, but nevertheless, the YouTubers who made that video are probably getting paid. They call it monetizing. And that's because the owner of YouTube is able to take advantage of the fact that you were interested in that and when you watched it in a way that makes them money, and they will pay YouTubers to create more content that gives them that access. So just because there isn't money does not mean you're not turning over some value. That value is not necessarily going to be used in your best interests. So in our world leading up to now, we've had ad blockers, we've had firewalls, content filters, maybe malware detectors. We've had all kinds of stuff running all over our hardware and our software and our networks. And all of those are threats in the new world, in the idea of the information age. Our ability to control what we see or even know what we're going to see next, for us to be able to predict where something is going to come from, is a threat to the way money is now made, because the money is not coming from us directly, it's coming from our behavior. So in 2013, there was a famous series of disclosures about the way the world works. Everybody who did not know the way that nations do spy versus spy violence on each other became aware of it, and they understood that surveillance was pervasive and that there was just always somebody watching everything, and some of it was domestic, although that was illegal. It was happening anyway. We found out that Cisco routers sometimes visited a secret lab where they would get modified to add electronics. Now, the people who were in that world, they didn't care. This was a yawner. They already knew all of this. But to the rest of the world, they suddenly found out the way the world has always worked, and they panicked about it. They got very angry. And so now we have this idea that the user has to be the king, and the user has to be protected, and everybody should be hands off for the user. But the user does not have an Ethernet port on the back of their brain. So what this really means is that the app or platform is the king. This should concern us, because those apps and platforms are made not just by dedicated volunteers creating open source stuff. That's a huge thing. But there are a lot of very wealthy corporations, multinational corporations, who already have information superiority over most nations, who are where these apps come from. And these apps might claim to benefit the user, but they will have some side effects that we should consider deleterious. It may be that some of these companies really care about end user privacy, or it may be that they're funding a lot of the pervasive encryption to combat the pervasive monitoring that nations were doing, in a way to make sure that they themselves were the only ones who saw information about their users. In other words, they may have more than one reason to think that pervasive encryption is a good idea. And we should try to enumerate those. And you should remember that the old adage is gone. It used to be that to understand what's really going on, you would follow the money. Now you follow the data. So content filtering relies on content analysis, And we've got HTTP version 2 that begins to really frustrate this. But also the ECH or ESNI, where you can no longer see the headers of outbound TCP or HTTPS transactions. This is going to get even worse with HTTP version 3, which is a UDP protocol. And so there's not even a system call where the app or the platform has to ask the operating system, please make a connection to a certain place. I wish to exchange data with that place, because that was an opportunity for your malware detector to say, hey, I don't want you connecting to that place. There's bad stuff there. Well, you can't do that unless there is a system call. And in HTTP 3, there won't be a system call except please transmit this UDP datagram for me. And so everything we thought we were doing with endpoint security goes out the window once the web more fully enmeshes itself in the information age. And of course, ad blocking relies on both content and connection analysis. And so you can begin to ask the question, who benefits if ad blocking does not happen as pervasively as it has? I want to say on-path actors have not been good stewards. They have abused their position to do all kinds of stuff. They monitor what users do. They sometimes block it, whether for national security reasons or for any reason. They might redirect it. There's all kinds of things that people on your path have done, and that was bad, and that led to the pressure that is being released now. But I got to say that just because that position was being abused does not mean that there aren't non-abusive uses of that position. For example, a network operator, corporate firewall, or a family filtering thing might say, hey, everybody in here is my employee or my family or whatever. I really do need to do those things. Please do not disenfranchise me. Well, that voice is not represented, and to the extent that it's ever issued, it is not heard. The internet was a network of networks. We understood that each of those networks was relatively independent. The web doesn't care about any of that. To the web, we are a network of eyeballs watching ads. Anything that gets in the way of that is just going to be dismissed as obvious old think. I've had people tell me that firewalls are so 1990s, I should follow the Beyond Corp model. Yeah, I can't. My smart TV or whatever it is has a mind of its own, and I can't find one that doesn't. So I got to have a firewall. I got to stop it from doing the things that are going to out me to its corporate masters. I don't have better choices. I can't make the smart TV maker or any of the other makers of devices subscribe to my Beyond Corp model. I got to have a firewall. You can see that there is a big chasm here. It's bigger than a generation gap. It's just a total concept mismatch. Ships are passing in the night. So here we are. Network operators still have to take responsibility for what their network does. If it spams somebody or DDoSes somebody, they got to answer for that. And now we're taking away from them the ability to monitor what's going on so that they could decide whether they approve of it or not. How can they be responsible for something that they don't control? Well, when I mention this, I'm told by the people who think all this is a good idea that I should just secure my endpoints. So again, we're not hearing each other. So my prediction is that the abuses that took place before the disclosures of 2013 and all this new encryption, universal encryption thing are going to be dwarfed by what will happen once nobody has the traditional monitoring or control points. Something else that's coming out of this that I want you to all think about is that in IP version 4, there weren't enough addresses for everybody to have their own, and so we used NAT firewalls, NAT gateways. And in IPv6, that's not necessary. Every device can have its own address, and so NAT could still be used, and some IPv6 networks are using it. But in general, you don't have to, and so in general, people outside of your network know exactly which device is responsible for which transaction. In other words, this really improves the ability to do surveillance and to update a model over what v4 had. That doesn't mean that that's why v6 is being pushed. We really are out of addresses. We really do need to do stuff like v6 to reach the future. If I want my flying car, it's not going to be speaking IP version 4. However, we do have to be aware of how things can be abused, because nothing which can be abused won't be. Also, in traditional DNS, a device would just use whatever DNS server was handed out by the DHCP server, which was usually run by the local IT department, or maybe it was the ISP. That gave them the ability to act on your behalf and look at the transactions that you were doing with DNS in order to figure out whether you were maybe infected with some kind of malware, joining a botnet, that kind of thing. And you could bypass this. If you choose to, you could say, I don't trust my ISP. I'm going to use whatever, OpenDNS or Google or somebody. But with DOH, the user isn't making that decision anymore. The apps, like browsers or platforms, are making that decision. I'm getting rid of my Chromecast because it refuses to listen to the DHCP assignment of DNS that I've made. It wants to talk to 8888, period. And I can't live that way. I'm currently just giving it an 8888 to talk to, but I know that once they switch to DOH, they're not going to listen to my DNS server pretending to be theirs. They're going to say, I'm sorry, you're not on the internet. You should let us do whatever we want, and then we'll let you watch your show. Well, I'm not going to live that way. You make your own decision, but I'll tell you that's mine. So finally, here's some specific stuff. Because DNS was clear text and unauthenticated, it could be viewed or modified by anybody who was on path, and even some people who weren't on path. And we've added some technology to fix that. DNSSEC can't modify something without being detected because the signatures will be missing or wrong. We then had to sort of add other stuff. DOT, DNS over TLS, which is on UDP or TCP port 853, was a way to say, I don't want you to stop me from reaching this server, or see what I'm doing and maybe stop the connection from taking place. So I'm going to encrypt it. But I'm going to encrypt it using TLS, which relies on X509, which is garbage, but it's what we have. And we then had the ability to have secrecy, the same level of secrecy that HTTPS has traditionally had, which is, I'm going to try this, and if you can be the man in the middle and see what I'm doing and stop me, you can go ahead, but you'll never know what my question was going to be. So it gave a limited amount of privacy. But that ability to block something because your local network does not want you talking to a remote DNS server, you've got to talk to theirs. That's the rule at my house and in my company, and apparently now in Russia. The web community said, this idea that you could block it in a firewall, that's terrible. And so they came up with DNS over HTTPS. So it runs on TCP port 443, and most firewall operators will take a step back from blocking all TCP 443 because that would cause their users to storm the castle carrying torches. But all of this was mildly detectable by firewalls because the TLS headers were in clear text. It was only your content that would be encrypted. And it turned out that the headers included the URL that you intended to visit and the remote host name that you wanted presented, the virtual host that you were going to present once the connection was open. And so that meant we could do this man-in-the-middle firewall, and all of the next-gen firewall vendors have this, so that you can see what's about to happen on your corporate network and decide, okay, that's somebody who wants to visit their bank and do electronic banking. I'm going to let that pass because it would be illegal in most companies to watch that. Or it could also be that they're going to a place where only malware would go. I'm going to stop it. So there were various reasons why you would do this man-in-the-middle stuff, but that is abusable by state actors. And so we now have this thing called ECH, used to be called ESNI, encrypted SNI. It's now encrypting all of the header, not just ESNI. They're doing this to prevent policy from being enforced because it could be a nation-state actor, and we have to protect the user. Okay, well, what am I going to do? For me, for my corporate network or my house, I'm not, maybe I am in some eyes a nation-state actor, but I've got to do this. I have responsibility for the safety of the things inside my firewall. What am I going to do? And moreover, what is the Great Firewall of China going to do? Some people have predicted that if we run China's costs up enough, they'll stop being an authoritarian country, at least on the internet. I have a different theory. HTTP3, I mentioned, is coming. And it's going to use UDP because TCP is not updated often enough in kernels. That was the original reason for it. We just need better congestion control, and it's true, we do. A lot of kernels have got really outdated TCP, and they don't handle congestion or fallback or any of that well. So here's a way that the app itself can just manage all of it using UDP datagrams and bypass the kernel, and very modern congestion control. And oh, by the way, the kernel will no longer be aware of when connections are taking place because all of these UDP datagrams are going to be so encrypted that you cannot tell where they're going or what they're about. That's the design. This is not an accident. If you read RFC 8890, some of you are going to say, yeah, you're going to raise your fists and say, yes, finally the user is winning. Others are going to say, wait, the users are not the only ones that are going to benefit from this. We probably needed a more nuanced solution. And you guys have lived, all of us on this call have lived through this era where code is law. And if you can write code that becomes popular, that will be the way the world works. And it doesn't really matter if it breaks the law somewhere. It would have to break the law everywhere in order to really not succeed. And very few things do that. And even the ones that do, that are against the law everywhere, for example, online child abuse materials, still pretty well thrive in the internet era in ways that they couldn't before the internet. And so we got to recognize that the code that is out there is what will determine the course of human history, much more so than what laws are passed. Participation in all of this is enormously expensive. I myself, although I'm the CEO of a company, I can allocate my time as I please. I cannot possibly allocate enough time to follow the working group about the transport, the quick thing or the DOH thing or the DOT thing. I end up getting 100 messages behind on some thread. And I know that there are decisions that have been made and consensuses that have been formed and reached that I should know about and I should have said something about, but I just end up declaring email bankruptcy and refiling it all. And that's me. That's what I have a lot of background in this, and I have a lot of freedom. Imagine the rest of the world whose future is being shaped by all of this development, whether it's protocols or software, who can't afford to participate at all. They don't have the background. They don't have the hours in the day. They can't participate. And yet, they are the ball, and this process is the bat. They're going where the ball hits them. So I got to say that without access to first world wealth, it's very rare to be able to participate in either an open source software or an IETF working group, because you just can't. It's not just that you can't afford airplane tickets. You can't even afford, the laptop to run Zoom on, or the hours in the day to do it, or the potentially years of study it would take for your comments to become relevant. So what we have is another case where the wealthy first world is determining how the future is going to look, and everybody else is along for the ride. And that doesn't mean that anybody's got bad intent. That's a fact. That's the way it is. We're not exchanging think papers in journals and giving people months to process that and write their own response. No, it can be 100 messages back and forth in a 2-day period, and the decision is made. And you just got to live with that, because if you then catch up a week later and say, wait, I have an opinion about this, nobody's got time for that. They're on to something else now. They don't want to hear what you think unless you were there in the moment. So it is a form of tyranny, although it's not meant to be. So traditionally, DNS worked like this. Questions came from the bottom, answers were at the top. There's a firewall to make sure that the stub resolvers, that's your laptop, your smartphone on the Wi-Fi, that kind of thing, had to use only the local recursive server to forward your answers or your questions, get the answers, cache them, all that sort of thing. This worked. It's worked for decades. But this era is over, because sometimes that IP firewall is run by a nation state or other actor, maybe an abusive ISP, that you just don't want to surrender any control or monitoring to. And so, we got DOT because that solved the problem of being observed, but it did not solve the problem of not being blockable. So then we got DOH. We've now got 2 different encrypted DNS protocols. Currently, DOH runs over TCP, because that's what HTTPS does. But once we have HTTP3, DOH is going to be using that. So it'll be UDP, but there's a whole bunch of layers between it and DNS that are beneficial if you have a certain political outlook. And so I'm pretty displeased about this. But this is how it looks. My team has added DNS tap, so you can have sort of provider independent monitoring of that recursive server, so that you can do whatever kind of observation and analysis that you want to do about your own traffic without having to look at the wire, because that's encrypted anyway. But, BPF and PCAP are kind of harsh mistresses. It's better to have the data come to you from inside the DNS server. And then we also developed RPZ, which is sometimes called DNS firewalling, so that you can instruct your recursive server in a vendor-independent way. By the way, I want you to lie about certain things. If this question comes through, block it. If this answer comes through, block it. Here's, and again, if this is you protecting your family or your employees, there's nothing wrong with this. That you have that responsibility. This is how you exercise it. But now we have this whole thing on the left, which is applications doing DNS, and they're bypassing all your firewalls, going directly out to some recursive server out there that's speaking the DNS over HTTP protocol and getting answers from the authorities that you don't ever see. And so you've got all this stuff now bypassing the thing that gave you the ability to exercise responsibility. It also bypasses the easy ways of doing this. If you're a nation state, it won't stop a nation state from taking action. It'll just run everybody's costs up. So we're going to make these slides available. And so in the interest of time, I'm going to skip through some of this. I just want to say there are a lot of other things you might want to do, like have a private domain that, of course, an application doing DNS won't see. This means the internet is viral. You can no longer have a private internet that then sees certain things as being only reachable on the global internet. We're now saying everything is global and nothing will be private. The internet is now all or nothing. I don't like that approach. I do want to say the one-party rule in China is not particularly worried about this because they can block whatever they need to block, and they could even have a mandatory proxy for the whole country. Right? They've got 1 million citizens that are working in the Great Firewall complex. They can certainly afford 2 million if that's how it's going to be. They can do whatever they need to do to make sure that authoritarianism continues. So the idea that a bunch of plucky volunteers in the IETF are going to make that impossible and change the course of human history because code is law doesn't work in the actual use case for which all of this was convened. So the meat of the matter is that Google's DNS clients, both in Chrome and Android, are using DOT or DOH if it is available for the server they're already being told by DHCP or by the user to use. So they don't select a different server. They just upgrade the protocol they use to talk to that server. And Windows is doing more or less the same thing. Apple just announced iOS 14. They are doing roughly the same thing, although I want to say Apple has implemented something that allows a website to say that this is my authoritative DNS server. And so if you're fetching other objects that are subsidiary objects from this index.html page, you could just bypass all the recursive name servers and go directly to the authority and we'll give you the answer. And that sure makes things faster if it's all CDN and it's all sort of global. But it also means that if there is defacement and there's something wrong somewhere in that web complex, your IT administrator no longer has the ability to see that you were talking to something bad because that all that information has been shrouded from her. I hate that. I hate that approach. The approach that everything should be disintermediated in favor of the user, but they don't really understand what the user is. So I'm planning on answering Apple on that point, which I've done, but they've got a lot of customers and they got to do what they think is best for those customers, so they may not listen. Google's DNS over HTTP servers have been promised to run on this well-known address of 8888 and 8844. And that means that an IT administrator who wants to block DOH can get rid of a lot of it by just saying you can't talk HTTPS, TCP port 443, if this is the server you're going to. Just don't try because it won't work. On the other hand, not everybody has done that. So IBM and Quad 9 for their 9.9 resolver has promised, it's not the 9.9 address, but they have promised what addresses they will always use for DOH so that they can be blocked. They understand that they need to be blocked by some people. Cisco for OpenDNS and Umbrella is also easy to block. They don't have address agility, but Cloudflare does because they use address agility to resist DDoS. So they're not willing to make any commitments as to where they're going to be answering DOH from, so you can't pre-block it. And I want to say Mozilla has turned on DNS over HTTPS by default in the USA. They haven't quite decided to do this in GDPR land over in Europe yet, but they're doing it in the US. And that bypasses whatever name servers the host was using, whether the user thought it should be 888 or whether the sysadmin thought it should be the local, the ISP's name server, whatever. None of that matters. If you're running modern Mozilla, it's using DOH, and it is talking directly to whatever trusted recursive resolver they chose, of whom, of course, Cloudflare is one. And oddly enough, Quad 9 is, I think, another. I know Comcast also has one. So there are a lot of them. You're not automatically sending all of your most PII, personal information, or personally identifiable information to a single place chosen for you by Mozilla, but it will be some place that was chosen for you by Mozilla. And again, the bypass costs of this should be clear. Now, we have choices. Those of us who run networks, for example, I have a hypervisor in this laptop, so I am a network operator wherever I go. We have choices. We could just give up and say, whatever I thought I was going to get from DNS filtering or DNS monitoring, I surrender. I'm just going to let malware do whatever it wants. Okay. You could say, my network's not secure, and if it's DDoSing you, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do about that. Go talk to Mozilla. There is no perimeter anymore. If we could make smaller networks and say, on this network, you can only reach the places I know you should be reaching, that's really damned expensive. You can allow all of your IoT devices to have unlimited access to their motherships, even if what they're sharing is sounds or videos or the size of your room as revealed by a Roomba, to people that you don't have a contract with and you don't know what legal regime they're under. You could just do that. You could say, hey, the internet's viral. I don't care anymore what my part of the internet, my network out of the network of networks is doing. And you could give up whatever ad blocking you were doing other than what is allowed by the browser, because you can't do it in the OS anymore because the browser's bypassing the OS. Or you could say, actually, I liked the old way better. Possession is 9/10 of the law, and if you want to get out, you got to follow my rules. This means a lot of us will be installing proxies and telling every client to use them, and any client that doesn't use them will fail, including whatever your IoT devices are. The IoT industry will scream bloody murder if that happens, but if we give them a way to negotiate for the identity and the keys of the local proxy, they'll probably use it, which will then restore control to the network operator, to the real user, which is whoever's responsible for the safety and policy of a network. That's what 8890 should have said. So here's the news. This came out a few days ago. Russia has a IT law, and they can amend it anytime they want. They don't love Telegram, and Telegram doesn't love them, and there's a big fight about that. So that it's not clear that this law will be all that effective, but it mirrors a law that is already on the books in China and is already on the books at my house. So, yeah, you got to reveal your destination, or I'm not going to let it out. That's my position, and I'm feeling sad that that position is shared by nation states. But just because Putin likes to ride horses and I like to ride horses doesn't mean horses are bad. If you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own. I'm going to block most of this crud in my firewalls, both the laptop, my house, my business. You're going to do the same, because you cannot go completely naked, covered in honey through the internet. You know better. Now, UDP has been pretty rare. Other than gaming, I have denied it for years and nobody's complained. So, as each new game comes to me as a complaint, I figure out what UDP to allow to make those complaints go away. But in general, UDP is blocked. I treat it as privileged because it can be used for stuff like this. I need the connection event to be visible to my OS kernel, because there may be some places I don't want to let that app go. I need the DNS lookups to be visible, so they have to come to my name server where I can look at them. This is not appropriate activity for a nation state. I don't like the idea that China and Russia, and probably Turkey and others are going to do this too. I think if it's a public network, commercial network that people are paying for, you probably ought to let them do what they want, because you're not responsible for everything every one of them does the way that you would be if it's a corporate network or a family network. But again, I am the baby, it is the bathwater, and we're all going out together. I want to remind all of you that IoT is never going to be profitable for the sale of the device. The devices are produced at a cost greater than whatever you pay for them, because during their lifetime, they're going to reward their mothership with enough information about when you turned that light bulb on and what color you chose and how much energy you burned. That can be used, that can be monetized, that can be used to predict and control your activities. So IoT is surveillance capitalism at its most irresistibly powerful. So you got to think about whether you want that smart TV to be on net or not. You probably will never have the source code to it. Besides its vulnerabilities, it also just has design goals that are set by its corporate owners, not in your interest necessarily. Now, there will be some side costs to all of this. Complexity tends to be multiplicative, and we've already reached the point where most people don't know how some things work. When we get to the point where nobody knows how anything works, there are going to be some real outages that go on much longer than they should. And most vendors have no idea what's in their own supply chain. They don't know what they're shipping you. Of course, buyers have no idea what's in their supply chain. They don't know what they're buying or what it does besides what they bought it for. So here's my message. Don't remain seated. Don't sit there thinking, yeah, this is all fine. No, shit's on fire. You're in a fight. You didn't know it maybe until now, but you're in a fight. So fight. Floor is open for questions.
Paul, thanks. Love your talks. It was Joff here. So one thing that was not quite clear to me, and perhaps you could clarify, it was my hope that DNS over TLS would also be supported resolver to resolver so that the DNS could operate traditionally how it was supposed to operate. Is that actually a true statement? Can you comment on that?
DOT was certainly contemplated as being used everywhere, both from the stub resolver to the recursive and from the recursives to the authoritatives to fetch cache miss data. However, because X509 is a dumpster fire, we don't know what key to use because we've always communicated with those name servers by IP address, and we don't necessarily know what TLS startup credential they should be sending us and how we should know that it's the one they should be using. So there are some ideas out there, but this turned out to be the deployment. I mean, this is the second or third 90%, right? The first 90% is coming up with the idea and proving it could work. The second 90% is kind of making it ready for the world, and the third 90% is making the world ready for it. This third 90% was not contemplated when DOT was designed. So yes, there is a lot of pressure to get this done because DOH absolutely won't work on that path. But we don't know exactly how long it's going to take. If you send money to NLNet Labs in Amsterdam or ISC in California or CZNIC Labs in Prague and say, I'm sending you money so that you make DOT work, they will take your money and they will make DOT work. But remember, they're all volunteers. I mean, they're employees, but the corporations are volunteers. They need funding to guide their priorities.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I just want to say how much I support your outrage. There's a very good book out there, just for folks. I'm going to do a shameless plug here because I read it. It's called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, and if you don't understand what's happening in the current world, I highly suggest that you actually really learn about what's happening with surveillance capitalism. What Paul is talking about here dovetails exactly into the continuing robbery of our privacy and wholesale profiting off of everything that we formerly thought of as privacy. So it's a very, very important issue, and I absolutely 100% am behind the fight statement, Paul. So given that statement, what are some of the ways that people can actually fight? You just mentioned a couple, and that is potentially funding or trying to fund the efforts that are potentially good solutions. Have you got some other thoughts of ways we can get behind a fight to make this right?
Well, awareness is always the first thing. Let me turn my camera back on. So, knowing that this is happening, this is what people want, and that just because they're profiting, that doesn't make it bad, but the fact that they're profiting by being able to predict and control your activities, change your opportunities to their benefit more so than yours, should cause you to be a little bit panicked. And so, if you've got a smart TV, probably putting it on net is the last thing you should do. Make it run in dumb mode and go buy a Fire Stick or even a Chromecast if you can stomach its DNS behavior. Make sure that you don't give anybody a vertical platform that is completely opaque to you. Go find somebody who loves Apple and ask them whether Little Snitch is as effective now as it was 5 years ago, or if a lot of Apple's own phone home traffic is now happening below the mock kernel, so Little Snitch doesn't see it.
Yeah.
Right? Go suspect everything, go learn a little more, and move a little bit more carefully. That would be a beginning, but maybe do some blogging, go give talks like this one, figure out things that I have not even begun to panic about and go tell the world about them.
Yeah. Yeah.
By the way, I've met Shoshana.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Paul, please.
I've met Shoshana, who's the author of the book that you mentioned, and she is unaccountably brilliant. She is a once-in-a-generation talent in her ability to make things clear that are actually not clear, but they are when you talk to her or when you read her book. So I heartily second your recommendation.
Yeah, thanks for that. I just think the two most influential books I've read recently, that was one of them. An amazing book. I haven't actually quite got through it all. It is a lot to digest, but her ability to have a clear explanation is just incredible. The second book that for those in the field that I would highly recommend is Countdown to Zero Day by Kim Zetter. That's a book about Stuxnet, which is an incredibly good read. There are so many good reads out there, but it is important for all of us in the community to be aware that surveillance capitalism is a machine that we've allowed to grow over the last 2 decades that is intent on owning everything, and we just need to wake up, and we need to be aware of it. So, Paul, I'm right there with you. I wish I was having a beer with you like we were a couple of years ago. But that was a good time. Really, really appreciate you coming to visit us again and giving the DNS talk. It's very, very much appreciated by the community, I know. I think we're coming up the top of the hour, so we do have another speaker. But, Paul, if you're able to spend a little bit of time in Discord, if you're willing, there may be a few questions there that people will follow up with you and maybe half hour.
Absolutely. I'll crank that up immediately. Thank you again for inviting me. And as Arnold would say, I'll be back.
All right. Excellent. Thanks so much, Paul.